Hey everybody, I hope you're doing well. Let me ask you a quick question. When you're making plans for the future, whether it be going on a trip, whether it be trying to get into a certain college, whether it be pursuing a certain career, don't you start first? Don't you sort of step back and say, what do I need to make that happen? And do I have the things I need to make it happen? For example, you want to go on a trip to Hawaii, because who wouldn't? You want to go to Fiji, because who wouldn't? You want to go to Tahiti, because who wouldn't? But you can't just go. You got to step back first and you got to understand, do I have the money to pay for the plane ticket? Do I have the money for a hotel? Where am I going to stay? Do I have the money for food and transportation? And you have to essentially sum up all the costs and decide, one, do you have what you need to go do that? But secondly, is it worth the cost? If I'm going to end up spending $3,000 on this experience or this trip, is it really worth it? If I'm going to go to that college and I'm going to end up $50,000, $100,000 in debt, is it worth it? And maybe it is in some cases, but at the same time, if you don't step back and check that first, you'll end up misunderstanding or making a mistake about where you're going. Jesus has this great example that most Bible commentaries, most teachers would call counting the cost, which is an interesting phrase in the context of following Jesus. But I hope you could see that there is a cost, right? And that we need to understand that before we get into it. And we need to get into it for the right reasons. But in the end, I think if we really understand who Jesus is, it never feels like a cost. It's like this. We've been looking at Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. And right after the Sermon on the Mount, what Matthew does is he shows three examples of healing, right? Three stories of healing to show how Jesus is God. He's got the power of God. He heals a man with leprosy. He heals a servant of a centurion just by his word. Then he goes and he heals many people. So after all of this teaching, now there's the actions to back up Jesus' claim to being God. But in the midst of all these miracles, in the midst of all these exciting things, in the midst of what people could get because of being close to Jesus, there's a story or example that Jesus has that Matthew records that points out it's not about what you can get in following God. It's really about what you can give. And I hope that we could really internalize that principle, that it's not about what you can get by following Jesus. It's really designed to be about what you can give to humanity because you're following Jesus. Let me read this brief exchange in Matthew chapter 8. It's verse 18, 19, and 20. It says this: when Jesus saw the crowd ahead of him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake. And then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus replied to him, "Foxes have dens and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." That essentially, animals have homes, but Jesus doesn't. If you want to say it one way, Jesus was homeless. And Jesus is saying, if you follow me, you need to follow the lifestyle that I'm living. Now, this doesn't mean that just by saying I'm going to follow Jesus, you will sign up for a life of poverty. You'll never have a home. You'll never have a place to live. But what it does mean is that everything you have, every dream you have, every plan for the future, whatever it is that makes you you and the things that you have, you give up all of those to God to do with as he directs and as he pleases. And maybe he ends up putting you in a bigger home. Maybe he ends up putting you in a smaller home. Maybe he has you only renting because then you have the freedom to leave and to move somewhere else when he calls. That in a sense, Jesus doesn't have this permanent place to lay his head because he's always giving. He's always following the lead of God the Father into how he can best serve humanity. That as all of this teaching had just taken place and now all of these miracles start happening, we could look at God, and we even do today, about what we can get, right? Isn't it so often that we think about God and Jesus and say, we get salvation, we get to go to heaven, we get to be forgiven. And while those things are all true and accurate and amazing, it's not just about what we can get. It is much more about what we should give because of the things that we have received. That Jesus begins to paint a picture of what it means to follow him. That if we are not willing to give everything up, we are not ready to follow him. So before you make that choice, count the cost. Think about it. And then the amazing thing that I know will happen if you truly choose to follow Jesus is that cost, that a lot of people use that term, doesn't feel like a cost at all because of how much we've received. That letting go of this one thing or pursuing this other thing or giving up something else, it doesn't feel like anything at all because of what we have gained. So in the end, even though you might look at it from a human perspective and say there was a cost, I think if we could look at it with an eternal perspective, we would always realize how much we have gained. That the life of following Jesus is never about what we can get, but it's so much more about what we should be giving. I hope that we'll internalize that and try to live that out in our week ahead. God bless.